we have seen how the supply curve is obtained. It is also important to understand how the demand curve is created. We have seen that the tangent point between the indifference curve and the budget line corresponds to the point in which the consumer maximizes his utility, considering a certain budget. In the following example, we can see three equilibrium points. The first one happens considering that beef costs $4 per pound. The second one considers that beef costs $3 per pound, and the third one considers that beef costs $2.50 per pound. As it is shown by the graphic, the amount of beef bought increases with the decrease of the price per pound. The graphic that shows the relationship between how much beef is bought and how much it costs corresponds to the demand curve. The market demand curve corresponds to the horizontal summation of individual consumer demand curves. The law of demand states that the quantity of a good demanded varies inversely with the price of the good. This is true for the so-called normal goods. A normal good is defined as a good whose consumption increases in response to an increase in income. Normal goods include food, clothing, and automobiles. The so-called inferior goods are goods whose consumption declines in response to an increase in income. Inferior goods also include clothing and food of lower quality. When people earn more money, they first increase their consumption of inexpensive goods. However, when income reaches a certain level, consumers begin to shift out of inexpensive goods. A luxury good is a good whose consumption increases at an increasing rate in response to an increase in income. A necessity good is a good whose consumption increases at a decreasing rate in response to an increase in income. When the income of a population increases, people are able to buy more. Therefore, the demand curve shifts to the right. It is interesting to discuss about the so-called Engels law when talking about the relationship between income and how much food is bought. This law states that, as income increases, the proportion of income spent on food declines. This means that as people become wealthier, they spend more dollars on food, but the proportion of income spent on food decreases at a declining rate. Engels' law has major implications for agriculture. It implies that as income increases, production agriculture decreases in importance relative to the rest of the economy. Economists summarize the relationship between income and consumption with the income elasticity of demand. It corresponds to the percentage change in the demand for a good in response to a 1% change in income. If consumers of a given country start consuming more tea because it has become a synonym of a fancy habit, the demand curve shifts to the right. When a consumer is indifferent to two products, the rise in prices of one product makes consumers shift to the other product. In other words, when the price of a substitute increases, the demand curve of a given product shifts to the right. If the population of a given country grows fast, the number of buyers also grows. In this way, there is a shift of the demand curve to the right. When consumers believe that the price of a given product will increase, they buy more of that product. Therefore, when the price is expected to increase, the demand curve shifts to the right. All the concepts and equations used to measure elasticity of supply can be applied for demand. The major determinant of the elasticity of demand is the availability of substitutes. If someone always buys Marlboro cigarettes and its prices increase, this person is more likely to buy cigarettes from another brand. In other words, if there are more substitutes available, the price of a given product will be more responsive, or elastic, to the change of price. The demand for a given brand of cigarettes is quite elastic, but the demand for cigarettes as a whole is quite inelastic, since it is an addiction. Therefore, people are unlikely to stop smoking if the prices of all cigarettes increase. Thus, the elasticity of narrowly defined goods, in this case represented by Marlboro cigarettes, is greater than the elasticity of more broadly defined goods, in this case represented by cigarettes in general. The concept of elastic demand inelastic demand and unitary elastic demand, are also useful when discussing about the demand of a given product. Cross-price elasticity of demand corresponds to a measure of the responsiveness of the quantity demanded of a good to changes in the price of a related good. It is now time to talk about markets and how their equilibrium points change. It is important to know the difference between a market and a marketplace. The world market refers to the interaction between buyers and sellers. The world marketplace refers to the physical location where buyers and sellers meet to trade goods. It is the interaction between sellers and buyers that determines the price of a good, and the quantity of a good that changes hands. Markets work by bringing together producers who desire to sell their product at the highest possible price, and consumers who desire to purchase goods at the lowest possible price. Although the goals of buyers and sellers are opposite from one another, voluntary trades allow for the objectives of both groups to be met. The behavior of numerous individual buyers and sellers converge on a price or quantity from which there is no tendency to change. The market equilibrium occurs at the intersection of the supply curve and the demand curve at point E. At this point, the quantity supplied by firms at a given price is equal to the quantity demanded by consumers at the same price. The equilibrium price, or market price, is the price at which the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. The equilibrium quantity is the point where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. Any point other than the point E is a disequilibrium point and therefore unsatisfactory to either buyers or sellers, or both. In disequilibrium, freely operating market forces come into play to cause the market to move toward the equilibrium point E. It is possible to distinguish two kinds of producers. The low-cost producers are located to the left of point E, where the supply curve is low, and high-cost producers are located to the right of the point E, at higher prices. We have seen that shifts in demand and supply may occur due to different reasons. If the demand curve shifts to the right, a new equilibrium point, E1 is reached. At this point, the quantity supplied is higher than it was before. A good example of this kind of shift might be the increase in China's per capita income. This fact is likely to shift the demand curve for beef to the right, which will result in another equilibrium point. This new equilibrium point corresponds to a higher quantity of beef supplied, at a higher price. Another situation corresponds to the shift to the right of the supply curve. In this case, the change in supply results in a change in the quantity demanded. A good example of this kind of shift would be a technological change that results in the increase in supply of corn, or a shift to the right in the supply curve. In this case, the new equilibrium point corresponds to a higher quantity of corn demanded by buyers, at a lower price. In the real world, supply and demand curves are constantly changing, being pushed and pulled by changes in a large number of economic forces occurring simultaneously throughout the world economy. If the supply and the demand curves shift by equal quantities over time, the equilibrium price remains constant, while the equilibrium quantity increases. The government has the authority to legislate the retail prices of food and agricultural commodities. If the government believes that the market price of an agricultural product is too low, it can pass a law that mandates a price support for the good. In this way, the government sets a minimum price for a specified good or service. In order to enforce this market price, avoiding the market forces that would take the market back to the equilibrium, the government must buy some of the production. This happens because when the government sets a minimum price that is higher than the market price, producers respond to the incentive, producing more of a given good. Thus, there is an upward move along the supply curve. At this price, the quantity demanded is also lower than the quantity demanded when equilibrium is reached. In this way, the government has no choice but to buy the surplus production in order to maintain the market equilibrium. This surplus production can be used by the government in different ways. It can be given away to U.S. consumers through domestic food programs. It can be given away to foreign consumers through food aid programs. It can also be exported to consumers in other nations, or it can be destroyed. On the other hand, if the government believes that the market price of a good is too high, it can put a price ceiling. When such measure is enforced, producers respond to this incentive by producing less of a given good. In other words, there is a downward move along the supply curve. At this price, consumers would be willing to buy a lot more of this good. In this way, the price ceiling creates a shortage of a given product. There are three ways to describe market phenomena. The first one is using graphics and the second one is using stories or verbal explanations. We have used both ways to describe markets. A third way consists in using mathematical models, in other words, using equations to describe how the demand function and the supply function interact. When describing how the competitive firm operates in a market, it is essential to understand that there are different market structures. The market structure has a major influence on the prices and quantities of goods and services sold in a market. In general, the number of sellers in an industry is an important indicator of market structure. A monopoly has a market structure characterized by a single seller. The firm is the industry. At the other end of the market spectrum is perfect competition, that corresponds to a market or industry with four characteristics: numerous buyers and sellers, homogeneous product, freedom of entry and exit, and perfect information. Oligopoly and monopolistic competition lie between these two extremes. Oligopoly is an industry composed of a few firms, such as the automobile industry. Monopolistic competition is a market structure that combines some features of monopoly with some characteristics of competition. In a monopolistically competitive industry, many firms produce similar, but not identical, products, such as toothpaste, soap, clothing and many kinds of retailing examples. Monopolies are able to affect the price of output. In other words, they have greater market power when compared to competitive firms. In real life, firms hardly ever meet the four characteristics of competitive firms. However, small farms and shore-bound commercial fishery are industries that come close to the competitive model. For instance, most producers have access to market information provided by the United States Department of Agriculture. Besides that, their products are homogeneous, since wheat, corn and soybeans are identical across all producers. Moreover, farmers face no legal barriers to entering the market. It is true that starting a farm operation is very expensive, which constitutes an economic barrier, but still, there is no law against new entries. Farmers are also numerous, which means in this case that each individual firm is so small relative to the size of industry, that no single firm has any influence over the prices of inputs or outputs. We have seen that rational firms sell their products when the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost, which corresponds to the point B in the first graphic. The marginal revenue in this case equals the selling price and the average revenue. The total revenue in this case corresponds to the selling price multiplied by the quantity sold. The total cost corresponds to the average total cost to produce the amount sold, multiplied by the number of units sold. Profit corresponds to the green area, since it equals revenue minus cost. When the market price equals the average total costs, the producer has zero economic profit, but has positive accounting profit. When the market price is set below the average total cost, the firm experiences negative profit. Efficiency is a characteristic of competitive markets, indicating that goods and services are produced at the lowest possible cost and consumers pay the lowest possible prices, since the prices charged are no higher than the cost of production, or marginal costs. It is important to understand that the demand curve of a market is different from the demand curve of one producer. The point of equilibrium in a competitive rice market can be seen in the first graphic. The second graphic corresponds to the demand curve of one rice producer. Since all his production is sold by the same price, the demand curve for the individual rice farmer is horizontal, which means that this demand curve is perfectly elastic. In other words, its elasticity is infinite. The first graphic shows the quantity in millions of tons of rice, while the second graphic shows the quantity in tons of rice. The following graphics help to understand how competitive firms have positive profits when the demand curve shifts to the right. In this case, we are studying the flour market in New York City. Imagine that this market has reached an equilibrium, which corresponds to the point E0. At this point, the producers in the market have zero economic profit, which means that they have positive accounting profit. In other words, they are earning as much money as they would investing in another business. Imagine that the demand curve shifts to the right because of a population increase. This movement changes the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. The individual firm increases its profits, as seen in the second graphic, since the selling price becomes much higher than the average total cost for each unit. It is impossible for the individual producer to change the demand curve. However, he can focus his efforts on lowering his costs, which can be achieved by improving technology and cutting unnecessary expenses. When profits are high, new firms start to be created, which shifts the market supply curve to the right and creates a new equilibrium where zero economic profit is, once again, the reality. Producers are satisfied with this outcome and so are the consumers. Monopoly, monopolistic competition, oligopoly and cartels are market structures characterized by market power. In other words, these markets have firms that have the ability to affect the price of output. Therefore, such firms are price makers. A monopoly is basically the opposite of a competitive firm. In a market dominated by a monopoly, there are not numerous sellers, there is no close substitute, there are barriers to entry and exit, and information is not available. These firms face a downward sloping demand curve. The demand curve is in this case equal to the average revenue curve. However, the marginal revenue curve is not equal to these two curves. The second graphic shows the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve. This graphic also shows the marginal cost curve. The monopolist operates differently from a competitive firm, but both companies seek to maximize profits. Therefore, the monopolist will produce until his marginal costs equal his marginal revenue. In other words, the point A corresponds to how many units will be produced by the monopolist. The monopolist will set his price in order to maximize profits. The monopolist knows that he is able to charge PS1 because he is well aware of the market demand curve. By setting this price, the monopolist has positive economic profit, since this company sells its products for a price that is higher than his average total costs. In a competitive market, the price of goods sold by producers equals the marginal cost, which is an efficient social outcome. In a market dominated by a monopolist, this efficient social outcome does not happen. This is the reason why the United States passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, which regulates how monopolists operate. Monopolists exist for several reasons, including large fixed costs, locational monopolies, limited markets for highly specialized goods, and patents or licenses. A natural monopoly corresponds to a situation where a single firm has large fixed costs, making it most efficient for production to be concentrated in a single firm. In this case, if other firms started to operate, both companies would continue to have huge fixed costs, but each of them would not sell enough units to compensate their costs. In this way, the firms and even society are better off with just one company, a monopolist. This is why public utilities such as electricity, natural gas, local telephone service, mail delivery, and municipal water are either regulated monopolies or goods provided by some level of government. Firms that own unique locations can act like a monopoly and charge a high price for the uniqueness of the good. A golf course in Key West is a good example. Fine jewelry and art are good examples of markets for highly specialized goods. The firms in such markets operate much like monopolies. Most national governments promulgate patents to the inventors and originators of new machines, powerful medicines, and even new varieties of plants. The same governments promulgate copyrights on works of literature, music and art. Patents and copyrights are government licenses conceded to the developers of new products and techniques. Any inventor can apply for the patent that grants exclusive use of a product or technique to the inventor for a period of 17 years. This legal barrier to entry gives the firm a monopoly for 17 years, if no close substitutes for the product exist. Patents protect firms and give them the opportunity to recover their high research and development costs required before the product is available on the market. On the other hand, patents make goods more expensive to consumers, since it creates a kind of monopoly. Monopolistic competition corresponds to a market structure defined by many sellers, a product with close but differentiated substitutes, some freedom of entry and exit, and some availability of knowledge and information. Since products are very much alike, advertising and marketing activities become key characteristics of monopolistic competition. Coke and Pepsi are two firms that operate in a monopolistic competition industry. Many consumers prefer Coke and are willing to pay more for it. However, this is only true if the difference of price is relatively small. Therefore, Coke and Pepsi prices are similar. The monopolistic competitor can increase his profits by lowering costs or by influencing demand through advertising and marketing efforts that strive to show how his or her product is better than others. Monopolistic competition has been used as a criticism of free market capitalism. Under this type of market structure, many resources are wasted on advertising and marketing. Millions of dollars are paid to celebrities from entertainment and sports industries to endorse a large number of products. Command economies, such as China in the 1950s, produced just one type of clothing, and used the resources that market economies use for advertising and marketing to produce other goods. Oligopoly is a market structure characterized by a few large firms. The key characteristic of firms in an oligopoly are that the firms are rivals, even though they form an interdependent group. The behavior of one firm has an impact on the behavior of other firms in the industry. Collusion is the term used to refer to firms in an industry that jointly determine the price of the good. Cartels, on the other hand, are groups of independent firms that join together for the express intent of regulating and controlling their price and production decision. This kind of structure is illegal in the United States, but legal in other nations. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries is an example of a cartel. This cartel limits the oil production in its member nations, in an attempt to drive up the world price of oil. This is shown in the first graphic. The quantity produced is lower than the equilibrium quantity. Since less oil is produced, the price for each barrel rises. Therefore, the firms increase their profit, as seen in the second graphic. Instead of having zero economic profit, the firms of this cartel have positive economic profit. Society is once again worse off, since people pay more than the marginal cost for each barrel. Strategic behavior among oligopolists can be complicated. The rivalry between firms can lead to aggressive price competition, or effective collusion, or anything in between these two extremes. Volatility is a major feature of oligopoly. Rivalry among firms may maintain a price agreement for a short period, but it is often followed by a price war that keeps the price at a competitive level. We have seen how market structures that are not close to the perfect competition can bring forth inefficient social outcomes. However, there are some major economic advantages to the production of goods and services by very large firms. The primary benefit, stemming from growth in firm size, is economies of scale, which refers to lower production costs at larger levels of output. Most evidence suggests that large firms do not have a great influence on price, due to the potential competition from other firms. Thus, in most cases, it is likely that the benefits of bigness outweigh the costs. In simple terms, free trade carries many of the same implications as perfect competition. It is a hard-to-reach objective that can make many individuals better off. Globalization corresponds to the process of rapid reduction in economic, political, and cultural barriers between nations. Economic examples of globalization include free trade agreements such as the North American Free Trade Agreement and the European Union. All these agreements have the objective of reducing or suppressing trade barriers. Trade barriers are laws and regulations created to restrict the flow of goods and services across borders. Tariffs and import quotas are the most common type of trade barriers. Studying trade between producers helps to understand how trade might make both parties better off. Adam Smith defended the idea that people are better off when they work full-time in a specialized area. In this way, they can produce more of what they are better at doing and trade with others. A great athlete is likely to be better at mowing grass than his house cleaner is. However, he is better off by allowing her to do such activity while he focuses his efforts on his career. A numerical example makes this principle easier to understand. Imagine that there are two producers, a farmer and a rancher. They produce either wheat or beef. If the farmer spends 40 hours a week producing wheat, he will be able to produce 4 pounds of wheat and 0 pounds of beef. However, if he spends all his 40 hours to produce beef, he will reach the production of 2 pounds of beef and 0 pounds of wheat. It is possible to create a graphic with such data. This is the so-called farmer's production possibilities curve. It is possible to see that the rancher is more efficient than the farmer to produce beef and wheat, since he is able to produce more of both products when he works 40 hours a week. Before understanding how trade might make everyone better off, let us introduce the concept of comparative advantage. If producer number 1 has a comparative advantage in the production of a given product, it means that his opportunity cost for producing each unity of this good is smaller than producer number 2. In other words, producer number 1 has a superior productive capacity when compared to producer number 2. This explains why a given region of the USA usually produces corn. This happens because this region happens to provide lower opportunity costs for the production of corn. The previous example shows exactly how that happens. The data used in the last slide can be used to analyze two different moments. Imagine that, at first, the producers do not trade. They both work 20 hours to produce each good. In this way, the farmer produces 1 pound of beef and 2 pounds of wheat, while the rancher produces 20 pounds of beef and 2.5 pounds of wheat. Now, imagine a second scenario, where the rancher decides to spend more time producing beef and the farmer spends more time producing wheat. Besides that, they are now willing to trade. The farmer trades 1 pound of wheat for 3 pounds of beef. In this way, the farmer ends up with 3.5 pounds of beef and 2 pounds of wheat, while the rancher ends up with 21 pounds of beef and 3 pounds of wheat. Thus, both are better off trading, since each one has more wheat and beef than before. The third table helps to understand how the comparative advantage principle works. The opportunity cost of producing 1 pound of beef is equal to 2 pounds of wheat for the farmer. Meanwhile, the opportunity cost of producing 1 pound of beef is equal to 0.125 pounds of wheat for the ranch. Since the rancher's opportunity cost of producing beef is lower when compared to the farmer, the rancher has a comparative advantage in the production of beef, and, therefore, is better off producing beef. On the other hand, the farmer has a comparative advantage in the production of wheat. Therefore, the farmer is better off producing wheat. The modern environmental movement began in 1962 with the publication of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. Carson highlighted the potential problems associated with the use of chemicals, pesticides in agricultural production. The Earth Day, created in 1970 by a senator, helped to spread the concern for the environment. The so-called tragedy of the commons is often one of the major causes of environmental problems. This term refers to a situation in which a group of individuals, acting rationally, and in their own self-interest, deplete a shared limited resource, resulting in destruction of the resource and a negative outcome for all parties. The classic case of this phenomenon is the overgrazing of public-owned land. This usually happens when the rancher can use public land without paying any fee. In this case, he ends up using the land until his marginal revenue equals his marginal cost. Since his marginal cost is zero or very close to zero, he continues to graze until the land is depleted beyond beneficial use by ranching. The rancher stops producing when he reaches point A. In order to avoid this problem, many governments charge fees. These fees increase the marginal cost. In fact, the marginal cost becomes equal to the fee, if you consider that the marginal cost was zero before government intervention. Since the marginal cost is higher, the producer will continue to graze until his marginal revenue equals his marginal cost. This happens at point B in the graphic. Therefore, the quantity produced is smaller than the production obtained when there is no fee. In this way, the depletion of public land is often avoided. It is said that by charging a fee, the government is including the cost of maintaining the land productive in the future. The so-called externalities are a common source of environmental problems. An externality is defined as a consequence of an economic activity that affects unrelated third parties. The externality can be either positive or negative. A corn producer that uses chemicals to maximize his production is likely to create effects on many people living downstream, since such chemicals usually seep into the water supply. These effects are usually negative. In order to avoid conflicts and preserve the quality of production downstream, the government may decide to tax the herbicide used by this corn producer. In this way, the corn producer supply curve shifts to the left, which results in a smaller production. The tax is a way to incorporate the environmental cost related to the herbicide. This kind of tax is usually called Pigouvian tax. Governments may also try to regulate the quantity of herbicide that can be used. Both measures are broadly adopted by governments, but are very hard to enforce. It is quite complicated to measure the impact of the herbicide in different situations. Moreover, it is hard to estimate the economic damage to people downstream. It is also hard to determine if people downstream would prefer to buy very cheap corn and harm the environment, or if they would prefer to buy corn that is more expensive, and preserve nature. Economists often prefer the so-called private bargaining as a solution to conflicts caused by externalities. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Ronald Coase suggested that there may be no need for government intervention to internalize externalities. Coase suggested that the affected parties could voluntarily negotiate until the optimal solution is reached. This optimal solution does not mean that herbicide use would be zero. The optimal solution, in this case, means that both the corn producer upstream and the producer downstream can reach an agreement that benefits both. The cohesion bargaining is only possible if communication between all the parties involved is inexpensive. Imagine that you have two adjacent farms that produce wheat and coffee. Imagine that the wheat farmer has the right to use as much herbicide as he needs. Imagine that each gallon of herbicide provides lower additional revenue. The graphic shows how marginal revenue varies according to how many gallons of herbicide are used. Since legislation allows him to use as much herbicide as he wants, he will continue to do so until he has zero additional revenue for each gallon of herbicide. In other words, he will consume a quantity of Q2 units of herbicide. In this way, his earnings will equal the sum of the areas of the triangles A, B and C, since the coffee producer suffers with the negative effects of such herbicide. He will see his marginal costs grow with the increase in herbicide use. If the wheat farmer uses Q2 units of herbicide, the total cost for the coffee farmer will equal the sum of the areas of the triangles B, C and D. Instead of having such a high cost, the coffee producer could ask the wheat producer to accept a payment of $C to use a quantity QE units of herbicide. This quantity guarantees revenues of A plus B to the wheat producer. In this way, the wheat producer would earn the same amount and the coffee producer would only have costs equal to the area of the triangles B and C. Therefore, the coffee producer would be willing to pay an amount up to C plus D to the wheat producer if he used QE units of herbicide. The wheat producer, on the other hand, would be willing to receive any payment above $C to use QE units of herbicide. The same logic can be applied to the opposite scenario, where the legislation forbids the wheat producer to use herbicides. In this case, this producer would be willing to pay up to A plus B to use a quantity of QE units of herbicide. The coffee producer would be willing to accept any amount above B as a compensation for the economic loss caused by the use of QE units of herbicide. In this example, marginal costs and marginal revenues are represented by straight lines. This often does not happen in real life. In reality, cohesion negotiation is often difficult, due to the fact that producers are numerous, which makes communication expensive. This is the reason why the government often uses taxes and quantity restriction to regulate agriculture. As society develops, and the basic needs for food are met, the general population will increasingly demand higher environmental quality and greater food safety.